The spring of 1993 dawned quietly over the small town of West Memphis, Arkansas, a place where everyone knew each other and the streets were familiar enough that children could roam freely without fear. But that calm would be shattered in the most horrifying way imaginable. On the afternoon of May 5th, 8-year-old Steve Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore set out for what should have been a normal walk through their neighborhood. They were 3 ordinary boys, full of laughter and energy, with no reason to fear the world beyond their own backyard. By evening, their absence had been noticed. Families grew frantic, calling neighbors, retracing steps, and alerting authorities. The town that had prided itself on safety and trust descended into panic. Word spread quickly, whispered in grocery stores, churches, and schoolyards. Something terrible had happened. Over the next 2 days, a search party combed every corner of West Memphis, fields, streams, abandoned lots, desperation mounting with every passing hour. Then, on May 7th, the unthinkable happened. The boys' bodies were discovered in a shallow, muddy creek in a wooded area outside the town. They were bound with cords, their bodies positioned in ways that were ritualistic and grotesque. The horror of the scene shook the community to its core. Parents wept openly in the streets, unable to comprehend how such violence could touch their quiet town. Law enforcement struggled to make sense of what appeared to be a brutal, premeditated act, one that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the innocence of West Memphis. As investigators worked, the town's fear transformed into suspicion, and suspicion quickly found its targets. Among the whispers and rumors were 3 teenagers, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr. They were all local kids, but different from most. Damian, the tallest of the trio with piercing eyes and an intense gaze, carried an air of quiet defiance. Jason was more reserved, often keeping to himself, while Jesse, younger than the others, had an intellectual disability that made him more vulnerable to influence. Together, they were outsiders in a town where conformity was the rule, and difference often bred distrust. Their interests did little to help them. The teenagers wore black clothing, listened to heavy metal music, and explored ideas considered unconventional in a conservative community. They spoke of the occult and dabbled in mysticism, hobbies that, while harmless in reality, painted a dangerous picture in the minds of townspeople already looking for a villain. Rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers of satanic rituals, dark magic, and malevolent intent infiltrated conversations in churches, diners, and schools. In the absence of answers, fear and prejudice began to fill the void. The investigation quickly turned toward these 3 teens, a decision fueled less by hard evidence than by community hysteria. Police began interrogations, scrutinized their habits, and interviewed anyone connected to the boys. Friends, neighbors, and even casual acquaintances were questioned about the teenagers' behavior, clothing, and personal beliefs. The town's thirst for justice created an invisible pressure, pushing law enforcement to find culprits before facts could fully emerge. The story of that first week after the crime is a study in tension. Families mourned, the boys' parents were devastated beyond words, and the small town seemed to exist under a cloud of suspicion and fear. Every strange noise at night, every unexplained event was attributed to sinister forces. The investigators worked tirelessly, yet the case seemed to grow more complex by the hour. The ritualistic elements of the crime, the cords, the positioning, the apparent deliberate staging, led authorities and townspeople alike to see patterns where there might have been none, fueling the narrative of satanic involvement. Even among law enforcement, doubts and questions arose. Detective interviews captured conflicting testimonies, evidence was scarce and circumstantial, and the pressure of a grieving, angry community weighed heavily on those assigned to the case. The teenagers' reputation as outsiders made them easy targets, and soon Damian, Jason, and Jesse were no longer just local teens. They had become the embodiment of the town's worst fears. The media quickly picked up the story, amplifying the tension and drama. Newspapers and television broadcasts painted a picture of young satanic cultists, playing into the narrative already festering in the town. Headlines screamed about evil in the heart of West Memphis, and the public's imagination filled in the gaps between the facts. For Damian, Jason, and Jesse, every glance from a neighbor felt like suspicion. Every passing comment seemed to confirm their guilt in the fearful town's eyes. Yet, even amid the chaos, glimpses of humanity shone through. Some townspeople cautioned against jumping to conclusions, reminding others that appearances could be deceiving. Friends of the teenagers defended them, arguing that interests in music or the occult did not equate to violent tendencies. But their voices were drowned out by the tidal wave of fear. The story of those early days captures the dangerous power of assumption, the ease with which society can turn difference into a crime, and the fragility of justice when perception weighs truth. By the end of Part 1, the stage was set for a drama that would consume not only West Memphis, but the world beyond. The disappearance and murder of 3 young boys had unleashed forces far greater than the crime itself: fear, prejudice, and a community desperate for answers. Damian, Jason, and Jesse were no longer just teenagers. They were symbols of everything the town feared.
And as authorities prepared to take the next steps in the investigation, one question loomed over West Memphis. Would justice be guided by truth or by the shadows of suspicion and hysteria? Part 1 closes on a tense note, leaving the audience with the chilling realization that in West Memphis, appearances could kill, and innocence could be overlooked in the rush to find someone to blame. The crime had happened, but the real story, the story of fear, prejudice, and the fight for truth, was only beginning.
The town of West Memphis was still reeling from the discovery of the 3 boys' bodies when law enforcement turned their attention squarely to Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr. The teenagers had already been cast in the court of public opinion as the embodiment of evil, and the stage was set for an investigation that would blur the lines between fact and fear. The pressure on police was immense. The parents of the victims demanded swift action, the media hounded every lead, and the community's collective anxiety demanded justice fast. Jesse Miskelly Jr., the youngest of the 3 and intellectually impaired, became the first focus. Law enforcement brought him in for questioning, believing that a confession from him could unravel the case. But what unfolded during those interrogations was a study in coercion and desperation. Hours turned into an intense night of questioning, with detectives pressing, suggesting, and interpreting his responses. Jesse, overwhelmed and confused, ultimately gave a confession that implicated all 3 teenagers in the murders. But there was a problem. The confession was inconsistent with the known facts. He described elements that investigators knew could not have occurred, yet prosecutors seized upon it as the key evidence linking Damian and Jason to the crime. In the courtroom, this confession would loom over the defense like a shadow, a ticking time bomb that could overshadow reason and evidence. As the investigation progressed, Damian and Jason were arrested. Damian, with his quiet intensity, maintained his innocence. Jason, reserved but steadfast, also denied involvement. Yet the narrative had already been written in the minds of many. 3 teenagers, outsiders, interested in dark arts and heavy metal, were capable of committing unspeakable acts. The prosecution leaned heavily on this perception, presenting their lifestyles, clothing, and hobbies as proof of malevolent intent. The trial became a spectacle. Media coverage amplified the tension, portraying the teenagers as satanic killers, while the courtroom itself became a stage for fear rather than a forum for justice. Witnesses offered testimony that was often subjective, based on perception rather than concrete facts. Experts on occult practices were brought in to suggest that Damian, Jason, and Jesse were capable of ritualistic murder, turning personal quirks into legal evidence. The defense struggled against this tide of prejudice, aware that every detail, every gesture, every word spoken could be twisted into proof of guilt. Throughout the proceedings, the audience experienced a heightened sense of suspense. Would the jury be swayed by sensationalism or by the facts of the case? The prosecution painted a narrative that was easy to believe: a group of teenagers, strange and different, committing a ritualistic act that terrified a town. The defense countered with the reality of their clients, young men who, while eccentric, were innocent of these brutal crimes. One of the most chilling moments of the trial occurred when the prosecution emphasized the teenagers' differences. Damian's interest in occult philosophy, Jason's reclusive tendencies, and Jesse's vulnerable nature were presented not as harmless quirks, but as hallmarks of evil. The jury, like the town at large, struggled to separate behavior from morality, appearance from guilt. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Every look, every pause, every turn of phrase could tip the balance. The emotional weight of the trial extended beyond the courtroom. Families of the victims were consumed by grief and outrage, desperate for justice, and sometimes resistant to nuance or doubt. The teenagers' families, in contrast, faced the impossible task of defending their loved ones against a tide of fear and suspicion. The media frenzy intensified the pressure, turning a local tragedy into a story of national interest. The audience could feel the growing stakes with each passing day: innocence or guilt, life or death, justice or hysteria. As evidence was presented, the flaws in the case became increasingly apparent. Much of the prosecution's case rested on the confession of Jesse Miskelly, whose reliability was questionable. Physical evidence was circumstantial at best, and no forensic link tied Damien or Jason to the murders. Yet, in the climate of fear and prejudice, these weaknesses were often overshadowed by the narrative of evil that had already taken hold in West Memphis. The courtroom drama reached a fever pitch when witnesses described supposed ritualistic behaviors, interpreting teenage curiosity as sinister planning. The jury, the town, and the nation watched, grappling with the unsettling question: could such ordinary teenagers be capable of such extraordinary violence? Every day of the trial heightened suspense, with the audience pulled into the tension between belief and skepticism, fear and reason. Finally, after weeks of testimony and argument, the verdicts were delivered. Damien Eccles was sentenced to death, a decision that stunned both supporters and critics of the trial. Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly Jr. were sentenced to life imprisonment, cementing the belief that justice had been served. Yet even as the gavel fell, doubts lingered. Questions about coerced confessions, the influence of public hysteria, and the reliability of evidence remained unanswered, casting a shadow over the proceedings. Part 2 closes with a chilling reflection. In West Memphis, the line between fear and truth had become dangerously thin. The teenagers were now prisoners not just of the legal system, but of a society eager to find villains in its midst. The audience is left questioning the fairness of a trial conducted under the weight of public panic and the ease with which innocence can be overshadowed by prejudice. The stage was set for the next chapter: years of imprisonment, a growing movement for justice, and the global spotlight that would eventually shine on the West Memphis Three. Suspense lingered, not just about what happened in 1993, but about whether the truth could ever overcome the fear that had gripped an entire town. The fog hung low over the San Francisco Bay, its gray tendrils curling across the water, swallowing the distant horizon. Early morning light cast a pallid glow over the surface, as if the world itself sensed the tragedy about to be revealed. Police boats glided silently through the still waters, the faint hum of engines the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. Divers prepared to search beneath the waves, their faces grim, understanding that what they sought could confirm every fear the community had harbored or shatter what hope remained. When Lacey Peterson's remains were discovered, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Officers secured the area, cordoning off the shoreline while forensic teams worked with meticulous precision. Plastic sheets flapped in the wind, protecting evidence from the elements, while photographers and journalists hovered, eager to capture the haunting images that would dominate national headlines. The discovery was sudden, chilling, and inescapably real. The woman whose smile had once lit up Modesto was gone, and the fragile thread connecting hope and despair snapped into darkness. Scott Peterson's life unraveled in real time. The news of the discovery hit him like a physical blow. Police summoned him for questioning, and within hours, he was under arrest for the murder of his wife, charged with first-degree murder and later the murder of their unborn son, Connor. The community was stunned. Friends and neighbors who had once offered tentative sympathy now recoiled in disbelief. Was this the grieving husband, the man who had tirelessly joined search parties, or a calculated perpetrator hiding behind the mask of sorrow? The contrast was stark, a tension amplified by the relentless glare of the media. Court proceedings began almost immediately, setting the stage for a trial that would captivate the nation. Inside the courtroom, Scott appeared composed, though subtle signs betrayed tension. Clenched fists, a flicker of eye movement, the slight quiver of his voice when responding to attorneys' questions. The prosecution painted a damning portrait, laying out evidence meticulously collected by investigators, statements that contradicted Scott's initial accounts, surveillance footage placing him in suspicious locations, and forensic findings that suggested premeditation. Each piece of evidence tightened the noose around him, and every revelation sent ripples of shock through the courtroom and beyond. Witnesses provided gripping, sometimes harrowing testimony. Neighbors recounted unusual observations, a solitary man driving at odd hours, moments of agitation or secrecy that had seemed innocuous at the time but now carried sinister undertones. Friends of the Petersons shared intimate details about their marriage, revealing tensions that, while previously hidden behind the facade of suburban normalcy, now hinted at potential motives. The trial was no longer about speculation. It was a dissection of relationships, behavior, and hidden truths laid bare under the unforgiving light of legal scrutiny. Media coverage intensified, creating a near-constant feedback loop between courtroom drama and public perception. Anchors and reporters dissected Scott's every word and gesture. Experts debated motives and timelines, and conspiracy theories flourished online. The court of public opinion had already reached a verdict in many minds, adding another layer of pressure to the proceedings. Each day, the story grew darker and more complicated, drawing viewers into a labyrinth of emotion, suspicion, and horror. The prosecution's strategy was relentless. They described the day of Lacey's disappearance in chilling detail, the timeline meticulously reconstructed, the moments she was last seen, the empty streets she traversed, the abandoned trails that led investigators to the bay. They framed Scott's behavior not as grieving confusion, but as calculated misdirection, an attempt to appear innocent while concealing a crime that had shocked the nation. Each argument was designed to corner, to provoke doubt, to leave no room for escape. Defense attorneys fought to humanize Scott, portraying him as a man crushed by grief, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. They emphasized his cooperation with authorities, his participation in searches, and the emotional weight of losing a wife and unborn child. But the mounting evidence, combined with the relentless media narrative, made it a daunting battle. The courtroom became a stage where the nuances of human emotion clashed violently with the stark precision of investigative fact. Public reaction was visceral. In Modesto, some residents remained loyal, convinced of Scott's innocence, citing the loving husband they had known. Others recoiled in disbelief, horrified at the possibility that a man could commit such a calculated act against his own family. News outlets broadcast live reactions, showing crowds gathered outside the courthouse, their expressions a mix of anger, grief, and incredulity. The story had become a mirror reflecting the darkest fears and curiosities of society itself. Psychological tension ran high throughout the trial. Scott's demeanor was scrutinized, analyzed, and debated. Every pause, every twitch, every seemingly innocuous smile was interpreted as evidence, motive, or deception. Forensic experts explained timelines, cause of death, and patterns of behavior, while attorneys dissected each word of testimony, challenging credibility and creating doubt. The courtroom was a theater of human emotion and intellect where strategy and sentiment collided and the line between truth and perception blurred. Outside the courtroom, Lacey's family wrestled with grief and public attention. Shirley and Dennis Peterson balanced mourning with the exhausting demands of interviews, media scrutiny, and legal updates. Their pain was palpable, their heartbreak laid bare before a world eager for closure. Friends offered support, yet even within their circle, questions lingered. How could this happen? Why Scott? Could justice ever fully restore what had been lost? Each day was a struggle to process tragedy while witnessing the relentless spectacle unfold. By the end of Part 3, the stage was set for the final act, the verdict, the consequences, and the reflection on a tragedy that would leave scars on countless lives. The investigation had revealed its darkest truths, the courtroom had displayed the full spectrum of human emotion, and the world had glimpsed both the horror and the heartbreak of what had occurred. The audience was left suspended in anticipation, knowing that justice and closure, though imminent, would carry its own weight of emotional resonance. After nearly 2 decades behind bars, the West Memphis Three, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr., finally stepped out into a world that had changed drastically since their imprisonment. On August 19, 2011, the trio walked free, released through an Alford plea. The legal maneuver allowed them to assert their innocence while acknowledging that prosecutors could likely secure convictions if retried. It was a paradoxical freedom. They were no longer prisoners, yet the stain of conviction and public suspicion remained. The moment of release was cinematic in its contrast. Families and supporters flooded the streets outside the prison gates, their cheers mingling with tears of relief and disbelief. Damien, tall and thin, with eyes that carried the weight of years in solitary confinement, paused at the threshold of the gates, breathing in the first unrestricted air of nearly 18 years. Jason, composed yet visibly emotional, embraced friends who had tirelessly fought for his freedom. Jesse, smaller in stature but enormous in the resilience he had built through the years, clung to the hands of loved ones, his expressions reflecting joy and the lingering trauma of a long, uncertain journey. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of media attention, celebrations, and difficult introspection. Worldwide, people celebrated a perceived triumph of justice, but the West Memphis Three themselves faced a complicated reality. They were free, yes, but they were also adults who had missed nearly 2 decades of life, friendships, education, and personal growth. They emerged into a world full of strangers, technology, and cultural changes, all while carrying the heavy shadow of events they did not commit. Reintegration was not simple. Damien, who had spent years in death row confinement, struggled with sensory overload, anxiety, and the persistent memory of isolation. He had learned meditation and spiritual practices behind bars, skills that helped him endure prison life, and now they became tools to navigate freedom. Jason and Jesse, while also facing challenges, relied on the support networks cultivated by their families, legal teams, and dedicated advocates. Every outing into public spaces required careful navigation, a balance between engaging with the world and protecting themselves from judgmental stares or intrusive questions. The story of their release also highlighted the unresolved grief and anger of the families of the victims. While the West Memphis Three maintained their innocence, the pain of losing Steve, Christopher, and Michael remained raw for their parents, siblings, and friends. Reconciliation was complex. Some mourners expressed relief that the system had at least acknowledged the uncertainty of the convictions, while others felt justice had never truly been served. This tension underscored the tragic complexity of cases where innocence and public perception collide, leaving no clear path to closure. The broader impact of the West Memphis Three case extended far beyond Arkansas. Legal scholars, civil rights advocates, and criminal justice reformers cited it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of moral panic, media influence, and coerced confessions. Documentaries, books, and news analyses documented the decades-long struggle, bringing attention to systemic flaws in the criminal justice system. Audiences around the world watched, riveted, as the story evolved from horror to tragedy and finally to a bittersweet redemption. For Damien, Jason, and Jesse, freedom was both liberation and a challenge. They had to navigate the psychological aftermath of prolonged incarceration, learning to trust again, to live with autonomy, and to find purpose after years of confinement. Every day presented new decisions and anxieties: where to live, how to work, and how to rebuild relationships with family and friends. Simple acts like walking unescorted down the street, shopping in a grocery store, or driving a car were simultaneously liberating and overwhelming, a stark reminder of the normalcy they had been denied. Yet the trio also found strength in advocacy and storytelling. Damien shared his experiences through writing and speaking engagements, using his unique perspective to illuminate the human cost of wrongful convictions and prison life. Jason and Jesse focused on connecting with supporters, participating in interviews, and helping others understand the flaws that had nearly destroyed their lives. Their stories became powerful tools for social awareness, sparking discussions on law enforcement procedures, interrogation practices, and the role of bias in criminal investigations. Emotionally, the trio's journey was a testament to resilience. Damien, who had faced death row, expressed a mixture of relief, disbelief, and lingering anger. Jason balanced gratitude with the sobering reality of lost time. Jesse navigated the challenge of independence after years of structured confinement, learning to make decisions that had once been made for him. Together, they represented survival against impossible odds, a human story of endurance, hope, and the will to reclaim life after injustice. The release of the West Memphis Three also raised difficult societal questions. Could a town recover from the moral panic that led to wrongful convictions? How could a justice system prevent bias and fear from influencing investigations? And most pressing, what does it mean for a community to reconcile with both grief and doubt? These questions lingered long after the celebrations ended, reminding audiences that freedom does not erase trauma, and that justice, while vital, is not always simple or complete. By the end of Part 4, the story leaves readers with a complex mixture of emotions: relief, sadness, awe, and reflection. The West Memphis Three were free, yet the consequences of their convictions, the lost years, public suspicion, and personal trauma would follow them indefinitely. The narrative emphasizes the human cost of moral panic, the fragility of legal processes when influenced by fear, and the enduring importance of advocacy, science, and truth in the pursuit of justice. The saga of Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr. closes on a note of cautious optimism. They survived, they endured, and they reclaimed their lives. Yet the shadows of the past remain, a reminder of what can happen when society lets prejudice override reason, and how vital it is to protect the innocent, even in the face of fear. The West Memphis Three became symbols not only of resilience, but of a justice system capable of failure and, occasionally, of redemption. In the end, the story is not simply about crime, punishment, or the trials of three teenagers. It is about humanity itself. It is a story of fear, judgment, survival, and the relentless pursuit of truth. It challenges audiences to consider the power of perception, the consequences of haste in judgment, and the extraordinary strength required to reclaim life after injustice.